The Poetry Nook is a cozy monthly conversation about the magic of poetry as a mirror and a container for our lives. In each episode, we bring one poem to the table, or maybe two or three, on a theme that speaks to us, and we talk through all of the language, the logic, and the emotions that come with each of them. I am Analía Gomez-Pidal.
And I'm Charlie Hunt. Welcome to the Poetry Nook. Well, it's great to be back in the Nook with you, Annie. I brought us some poems today about spring. The day we're recording this, which is March 18th, we're looking at a high of 76 degrees here in Boise, which is out of this world for mid-March. I gather that's not the case everywhere. I know you've had like a long snowy winter in DC.
I will add this caveat. I will always ballpark Fahrenheit because I am a Celsius girl. But we woke up with about like 30 Fahrenheit or so today. So yes, we've been having, if anyone is familiar with the memes around weather in DC, they're very accurate.
Yeah, it's a wild ride. You know, we've talked about seasons and seasonality before, and how, you know, poetry is, I think, well positioned to tackle that, because it's really what we're talking about with seasons is change and things fluctuating. And sometimes, you know, you can count on the seasons happening every year, but they never happen in quite the same way, and they show up in a lot of different ways. And sometimes you get fooled into thinking that one season is ending, but it's actually not. But around here it is, you know, some flowers are blooming and trees are budding, and, you know, it tends to be my favorite time of the year, but it doesn't come without its complications, as we know. And I've got a couple of different poems today that I think speak to, that accomplish what I like when poetry accomplishes, which is adding nuance and complication to a lot of the, you know, when you think of spring, you've got like, oh, it's like everything is amazing and the flowers are blooming and it's renewal and all this stuff. And I think, you know, that we'll see that in some of these poems, but I think these poems also add some interesting complications. So I'm excited to get to them.
One thing that, you know, came to my mind when you were describing this is I have very distinct experiences of spring from having grown up in the Southern Hemisphere and associating spring with September.
Yeah.
And now living in the Northern Hemisphere and thinking about spring in March. But we can delve into that later. Yeah. But it was like just one thing that clicked as soon as you were talking about this.
Well, especially people like me who like born and raised in the US, like a very Western and like Northern Hemisphere mindset. Like it would never have occurred to me that spring could happen in September. But of course I know that, and it's great to have, you know, someone who can give us that perspective. Well, and it's interesting too, because the first poem I think I'll read here, it's short and sweet. I don't know how much we'll have to say about it, but it's one I really like, and it's very on brand because it's about spring to some extent, but it's specifically taking place in March. So it is this kind of northern centric one. I'll just give it a read if you don't mind, and then we can talk about it a little bit.
Let's go for it.
Okay, this is Old Dog in March by one of my favorite poets, Ted Kooser. Old Dog in March. From a cold stone stoop, stepping down slowly into another spring. Stretching his back legs, one leg at a time. Making a bridge with his spine, reaching from winter out and out. Forever, it seems, then quaking at the end of it, all down his length, so that his claws skitter a little, losing their grip on the world. An old brown dog, gone stiff from chasing all winter through dreams, recovers his balance and, one ache at a time, lowers himself to the solid field of promise, where with pink tip of tongue between his teeth and frosty muzzle, he sips the cool, delicious, richly storied wind.
I will always appreciate anything related to dogs.
Any poem about a dog. We'll do a dog. I have many dog poems I can share, but yeah, it's always a good start.
What I liked the most about this poem was that after reading it the first time, the image of this dog was so vivid to me
Yes.
that it stuck with me for a little bit. And so I think like that is like my initial reaction. I have a couple other thoughts, but I'm curious to hear like what is it that made you pick this one?
So I totally agree with you. I can still see this dog. I like poems like this that are poems will sometimes capture a lifetime, or they will capture a whole season or a day in the life of somebody. And this poem is capturing probably like 6 seconds where this dog and presumably the owner, the caretaker of the dog, are stepping outside after a long winter in March. And the only thing this poem is about is this stretch that the dog does out from the stoop. And my dogs do this exact same stretch like every day. We don't have a stoop, but it's when my dog is like getting down from the couch and he puts his front paws down first, and he goes out and out, and the legs stay behind him. It's the cutest thing in the world. Dog owners will know what this move, where the legs stay behind them and they just stretch and re-enter the world, and it's very cute. But it's also the reason I chose it is because Kooser is using this stretch, this creation of a bridge that the dog is doing with his legs and his back, like as a metaphor for the bridge between winter and spring, which I think is really, it's simple, but it's really beautiful and laid out nicely. So on top of everything else, I just appreciate the metaphor and that, there's a bunch of different things I think being captured here. Certainly age is a factor here. It's an old brown dog, presumably has been through many winters and many springs and has seen this cycle play out again and again. And this is just the dog leaning into another one, sort of putting its front out first, but keeping its back paws on the cold stoop in sort of still staying in winter. I like that because it's an old dog, it's not this full-throated kind of leap into spring.
Yes.
Like the dog is literally leaving a part of himself behind for a second. And I think that's, to my point earlier about like complications, that it's not like, oh, this dog sees that it's spring out and is like, oh yeah, let's go, and leaps off a stoop. It's slow transition and it's easing its way in. It's quaking on the way down because it's an old dog, like the back legs shaking as
Mhm.
dogs can do. And I like that it's sort of tempering our expectations of what it means to like spring forward and like jump into spring the way some people typically think about it. So I like that element of it and using the dog to capture that.
Yeah. This might be a meta commentary, but this poem to me almost feels either like a continuation or the same scene as one of the poems that you picked for the winter episode in January, the one looking out the window.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which I am blanking on the author, but if like listeners should go check that episode if they
Yeah.
haven't. But there is this complimentary scene of someone looking out the window during winter, and then like once it's like slowing down, then like the dog also like gets ready
Mm-hmm.
so that they go out. So I found that like there was kind of like a continuation of a sentiment there.
Yeah, I love that. And this happens to me sometimes when I'm reading, especially like in one book of poetry where, you have poems from all different perspectives, but if they're in the same book, or in this case, in the same like podcast series, they start to feel, even if the authors didn't intend them that way, or even if it's different authors, they start to feel like different characters in the same story, and you
Mm-hmm.
can kind of put them into the same story and make that connection with them. And so I totally agree that like, this is that making this connection between these two these two characters is really interesting. I think in both cases it's also capturing something else about this poem and the other two poems we're going to talk about today, which is that it's not just describing what's going on in the season, right? It's not just saying like, okay, here are the changes that are happening, right? With flowers growing and birds chirping and things, or trees growing or whatever. It is taking a look at whatever is happening in the season through the lens of some character or through a window, or, you know, as we'll talk about later with these other poems, through the growth or the eyes of a loved one, or through some character from a bygone era. And that poems in this way, by adding this screen, adding this layer, can help introduce the complexity to the situation that just describing what spring is in a poem, which many poems do really well, does not necessarily accomplish.
Yeah, and to me, the description about this old dog reminded me of some of like the bigger picture processes that we go through. And so, for example, like there is this stanza of an old brown dog gone stiff from chasing all winter through dreams. So there is something there about how, you know, we talk a lot about seasons. We talked about it in the winter episode too. There is this sense of, you know, like this is a time in our lives, in our years, where we tend to kind of like retrieve or stay in kind of like inward, dreaming about the things that are yet to be, you know, like moved forward. And there was something so beautiful to me about this idea of like the action is happening, it's just like internal in the chasing through the dreams and preparing for what's possible later on.
Yeah, you have totally picked up on a line that I highlighted as well that I wanted to talk about, and you've interpreted it the same way that I did, which is really, which I think is really important. That like in the winter, sometimes we can feel a little cooped up, or like we're sort of spinning our wheels and not going anywhere with, you know, whatever it is that we want to be doing or actively trying to achieve. Some people are big like exercisers in the winter, or like they'll bundle up a ton and go running outside even when it's like 20 degrees out. I am not that like, I like running, I like biking, doing all. I am not a bundler upper. I just basically don't exercise in the winter. Sorry, everyone. But
I mean, for what it's worth, like exercise and I do not go hand in hand. So like the idea of even like going out to exercise in winter, I admire those who do. I need to be born again
yeah,
to do that.
yes, good for you, everyone, for doing that. So I don't do that, but the spinning the wheels thing, and I especially, again, this is where the use of the dog is really good, because I don't know if you've ever seen a dog do this, Annie. I feel like many people have, but like my dog does this all the time. Like as we're going to sleep and the dog is dreaming, and you can see its paws going, like it's clearly dreaming about like, oh, it's springtime and I'm chasing a squirrel, or like I'm doing this, but it's not actually going anywhere. And so what this stanza reminded me of, like gone stiff from chasing all winter through dreams. I think Kooser is probably getting at this phenomenon of dogs like laying down and clearly they're dreaming, but they're like chasing something through their dreams because it's winter. To a great extent, that's sort of what they're forced to do. But we do that too, right? Maybe not physically like the dog does, but in our minds. And then it's where stretching our way into spring so that maybe we can start to, you know, do some of these things, gain our grip on the world, as he's talking about, and sort of land into, it's not like we're necessarily going to do anything, but we're landing into this, what is my favorite line in the poem, which is the solid field of promise. That spring is not necessarily a time of all of your dreams coming true, or like all of the things you wanted to do getting done, but it has promise. It's at least it's bringing about possibility. And you know, maybe some things are going to happen and some things aren't, but at least now you have the opportunity because it's warm out and you're willing to re-enter the world and do all this stuff. So that one totally resonated with me as well.
Yeah, and I will say, I just a minute ago I said something, and I'm gonna backtrack just a little bit. Because yeah, I'm not an exercise person, but I do dance. And like one of the
Uh-huh.
things that, is also present in this conversation and in the visual of the dog is the need for kind of like that stretching before you go sprinting, which also happens in dance. And it happens in pretty much anything that we do in life that, like there is a little bit of that moment of easing into it so that it's not so much of a shock or a whiplash.
Uh-huh.
And there are, sometimes it has happened to me. I'm curious if it has happened to you as well. But, we often talk about or glamorize this idea of like overnight success or like changes overnight. The more time goes by, the more I realize that so much of that I have thought maybe was overnight for me had actually been like, brewing and
Uh-huh.
building in different ways over time. And so I think that in some ways, the promise of the spring speaks to that, right? Of the letting things slowly simmer into the action.
Yes, I totally agree. I think that is one of the big themes that is being gotten at here. The dog is the sort of the main character here, and by having the dog be old and easing into spring, and having learned maybe from previous experiences where it just leaps into things and ends up twisting its ankle, like this dog is doing the stretch, creating this bridge so that it can kind of, live in both spaces at once to keep that perspective. Then, presumably after this poem ends, like the walk begins. And then whatever will happen, and the dog will ease its way into it, just in the same way that we do. So I definitely think that's what's happening here. I think the other theme I see here is sort of curiosity, particularly at the end of there's unknown ahead, right? There's a lot of change coming. Spring is sort of, we traditionally think about it as a time of change. And some of those are good, some of those are bad. But, the dog lowers himself onto that solid field of promise, right? Okay, we're in spring now. And again, we're not just starting the walk and jumping in and running away with it. It's the frosty muzzle. Again, frosty, like still cold from the winter, and sipping the cool, delicious, richly storied wind, right? That spring can have this element of nourishment, right? I feel like that is sort of embedded in there. And he's just sipping, right? He's not completely taking it all in. He's like trying it out, testing the waters, and then, and then going for it on his own terms. And so in this way, I feel like, this old dog with the benefit of experience is sort of modeling a sort of timid but like responsible way of going into spring and being open to this change that is going to happen and seeing it as a beautiful thing, but not jumping into it in quite so intense a way.
It's either wisdom or this dog lives in the DMV area, so knows not to trust.
Right. Or it like thinks it's spring, but there's still like, 6 feet of snow piled up, or like a giant ice ball on the side of the road. Yeah. But the two other poems I want to talk about, I think, suggest something kind of bigger and grander about spring that I'm at least sort of trying to gravitate towards right now. So I think I'll move on to the next one if that's all right. This next one is by Tom Hennen, and it talks about spring, I think, from a slightly different perspective with different kinds of language that I'm interested to kind of get into. So this is Found on the Earth. The simple words no longer work. Neither do the grand ones. Something about the hanging bits of dark mixed with your hair. The everlasting quietness attached to the deserted barn made me think I'd discovered you, but you already knew all about yourself. As we stood on the edge of a forest with your dress as languid as the air, the day made of spring wind and daffodils. Then the sky appeared in blue patches. Among slow clouds, oak leaves came out on the trees. Grass suddenly became green, filled with small animals that sing. all the parts of spring were gathering. The earth was being created all over again, one piece at a time, just for you. So this one, I think leans a lot more into kind of the grand spring language, especially in the last few lines there. Like, you can hear like the choir singing practically with all of these spring items that are happening. I'm sort of curious about why that is. I don't know that I know myself, except that I suspect it has to do with the fact that this is also, it's a love poem. It's sort of mixing the poet's feelings about spring, or maybe supercharging them based on clearly how enamored with this other person the poet is, the speaker of the poem is. And I think sort of the the beauty of both the natural world around them that they're seeing, combined with the beauty of this beloved person, are sort of coming together to create something, some kind of grand version of spring that I think is very different from sort of the first, or at least in tone, very different from the first one we saw from the perspective of the dog. What's your take on what's going on here?
The one word that I associate this poem with is blooming.
Mm-hmm.
And I find it in two layers. Like you were saying, I find this in the blooming of spring, and then also in the blooming of the love that is palpable through this poem. But there are also such beautiful moments in the poem that really stuck with me. I really like the opening. It's almost like, like this sense of nothing that I know can work right now. Like it's almost like starting anew, which also feels a little bit, right? Like the transition from like winter to spring and being like, okay, like here we go again. And then I also love the two verses of like, made me think I discovered you, but you already knew all about yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And I think those two stuck with me because on one hand, there is that sense of discovery when we meet someone, whether that is romantically or not, but there is a sense of, like actual discovery. And at the same time, like I like the sentiment of like you already know yourself, but even if I put myself in the shoes of the other person, that to me is not true. Like the discovery is mutual, right? Because like
Mm-hmm.
so much of who we are is discovered through our relationships with other people. And so those two verses stuck with me because there is this idealization of the poet, of the person that the poet is thinking about, where I think that love that is blooming gets in the way of maybe thinking that there is more for the person to discover as well.
Again, you have hit on two things that I really loved about this poem, and that I definitely wanted to talk about as well. First, to quickly go back to the first one you mentioned, these first two lines: "The simple words no longer work, neither do the grand ones." Like, that's a pretty bold way to start out a poem, because the point of a poem is to use words to get across, some rich story or emotion, or something else. And right off the bat, the poet is saying, I could try to use simple words, but it's not going to work. And the grand words aren't going to work either. But of course, like, he uses both types in this poem in trying to get it across. So he's sort of saying, like, words aren't going to be enough, but we're going to give this a shot anyway, because I of the richness of the feeling that I have, to speak to the theme of one of the poems you shared last time, by accident, that this was this idea of like, there's so much happening in my heart and my brain that I have to get it out, even though these words aren't going to do it justice.
I agree with your take, and at the same time I think like this is also, can be a different conversation about like what's the point of the poetry, right? Is it the imagery? Is it like the emotions? Is it the words? And so I think that in some ways, like opening with those two verses is, this is not about being enamored with our own words. This is about the
Mm-hmm.
feeling. And so, like, let's just
Right.
use words as a vehicle here, to try to express what's happening, which is like grander than any words can portray.
Right. Like painting, painting a beautiful scene, doing a painting, that doesn't place you literally in the scene, but the painting is an attempt to sort of recreate that, not even necessarily in as like pitch perfect accurate a way as possible, but in a way to help get across the feeling of the person being in that situation. And especially given the complexity and the bigness of what he's trying to get across here, of like, maybe falling in love and seeing all of the, and the springtime and all this stuff. That's not something that you can like one-to-one recreate in any form of art, but you can but that's not necessarily the point, that you're making this attempt. And then going to this other part that you mentioned, the everlasting quietness attached to the deserted barn, made me think I'd discovered you, but you already knew all about yourself. In part is sort of suggesting, I think, in part that like one of the things that this person, that the poet appreciates about this subject, this person, is their self-assuredness, right? That the realization, the complexity, the beauty of this person almost has nothing to do with the poet beholding her, right? It was sort of ready-made in this way. But also that I think, to your point, that the rest of the poem gets to is that this person already has some kind of beauty, inner or outer beauty, that the poet appreciates. And then when put against the backdrop of the natural beauty, and to your point, when combined with the sort of mutuality that comes with real beautiful love, again, not necessarily romantic love, but between two people, it becomes something bigger than the sum of its parts and becomes something bigger than itself, that makes it even more beautiful than just like adding the 1 + 2 + 3 together gets you. And the leveraging of these grand words that, he says doesn't do it justice, but that he uses all towards the end. The grass became green and filled with small animals that sing, and like all of these things are beautiful in and of themselves, and they and this beloved person both make each other more beautiful just by being together.
There is a synergy, right? Like
Yes.
at the end of the day, that's what ends up making it, like painting this picture that goes beyond the words.
Yeah. I think it's it's a very sort of capital R romantic poem in a way. And as a hopeless romantic, I appreciate that. In some ways, it's sort of the springiest, like sort of classic springiest of the poems we have today. I like love poems. Like there are a lot of great love poems, but I like poems like this that they are love poems, but they are, attaching or hitching the romantic love or potentially non-romantic love to nature, to learning about ourselves, or like other questions other than that, and capturing the sort of cosmic sort of beauty of all of that. I really like when poems do that. Okay, so this last one, I I wanted to like make an effort not to like not repeat any poets in our first year of doing the Nook, but I couldn't resist because it's Mary Oliver.
We've done a few, but also this comes from the one co-host that has like the long directory of poems.
I know. But you know what? I make no apologies. This is my favorite spring poem. I've written about it before, and I couldn't resist. And I almost wasn't going to do it, but now I'm glad that we are doing it, because I think it has some interesting connections to the other two poems. So I will disclaim it, but I won't apologize for it.
There is no need to apologize. I am always going to be happy to read her poems, but also that since you have written about this before, like people can also find more about this poem on your Substack. you are here, which also was like the initial home of the Poetry Nook. So we
That's
can
right.
also include the link in the show notes.
Yes, yes, we will do that. Okay, so here's the poem by the late great Mary Oliver. This is Spring Azures. In spring, the blue azures bow down at the edges of shallow puddles to drink the black rainwater. Then they rise and float away into the fields. Sometimes the great bones of my life feel so heavy, and all the tricks my body knows, the opposable thumbs, the kneecaps, and the mind clicking and clicking, don't seem enough to carry me through this world. And I think, how would I like to have wings, blue ones, ribbons of flame? How I would like to open them and rise from the black rainwater. And then I think of Blake in the dirt and sweat of London, a boy staring through the window when God came fluttering up. Of course, he screamed, and seeing the bobbin of God's blue body leaning on the sill and the thousand-faceted eyes, well, who knows? Who knows what hung fluttering at the window between him and the darkness? Anyway, Blake, the hosier's son, stood up and turned away from the sooty sill and the dark city, turned away forever from the factories, the personal strivings, to a life of the imagination. You know, this is a poem I've loved for a long time. It is definitely about spring, but like some of the others, it's about so much more, I think. You know, there are many things I have to say about it, but first I want to check in with you, Annie. What's jumping out to you about this one? What do you like or not like about it?
So as you were reading it, there is something that stood out for me, especially in the earlier part where, you know, like she has this stanza about basically like kind of like setting it up for how she wished she had wings. And what stood out to me is like there is a corporal aspect to it that also reminded me of one of Frida Kahlo's like famous quotes about why having feet if I have wings to fly. Which I will say, this is a as someone who has studied and performed as Frida Kahlo at some point in my life, there is something that I do want to mention about this, which is she's very much referring to her losing her feet, like actually losing her feet. And that's how she's reframing that trauma, by being like, well, I have wings, right? And so that is what this poem and this segment of the poem by Mary Oliver brought me back to, because I feel there is a similar sentiment here of Oliver being kind of like pointing to perhaps like some of like the difficulties of the body, or like
Yes.
feeling, you know, the body at this point in time, and wanting to escape through imagining having wings.
Yeah, there is. I think transcendence is sort of a word that is not in this poem, but is sort of laced through this poem of having circumstances, whether it's within the body or things happening in your life, or in the case of the sort of character who is introduced later in the poem, who we can talk more about this, but she's referring to the English poem William Blake, sort of rising up from sort of horrible kind of or at least we would think of as horrible circumstances in like 18th century London, where it's, you know, dirty and polluted and all these things, and rising out from poverty and sort of becoming this big romantic figure. That there are these circumstances or drawbacks or things that are hobbling us. You know, she talks about the great bones of my life feeling heavy, and the kneecaps and the mind clicking and these things. And with the example you just gave, I think is also in that category where, you know, you've got all these things, and then she's sort of, again, sort of looking out into the world and seeing these blue azures. And azures, for those who don't know, are they're butterflies, right? They are, with the most sort of beautiful, splendid wings. And, if you did like Family Feud style, like asking people to list the 5 most beautiful animals, like probably butterflies are going to pop up in a lot of people's lists. And so again, we have, similar to the first poem, well, 2 similarities to the first poem. One is that we're using an animal, something that is not us, to talk about something aspirational, or an aspirational way of thinking about these transitions. And in the other way, as you were talking, what I was thinking of was, the limitations of the body. And that's what we saw described with the old dog, right? The quaking of the limbs and the stretching, and we have these limitations. And part of this, whatever kind of renewal comes with spring, means recognizing these limitations and then thinking about the different ways, sometimes ambitiously, about how can we transcend them. Maybe we don't literally have wings, but we can try to embody the spirit of these azures, the butterflies that we're seeing, or in the way that she describes, Blake in the 18th century, of seeing God, whatever that means, through the window, and then rising up out of that situation.
There can be a deeper conversation about the transcendence part, particularly, depending on like how spiritual or religious you are, and kind of like thinking, if we are souls in bodies, or if we are bodies who have souls, like,
Yeah.
there is a whole lengthy conversation to have about that. But I think that, if anything, the sentiment that stays with me in this one poem is, I think I agree with you in like the similarities with the first poem, and kind of like seeing that that very concrete image that helps us think about, what's ahead. And at the same time, in this poem, there is something that feels a lot more spiritual, a lot more about, it's not so much about action as actually like I would like directly connect the sentiment of this poem with the verse about the solid promises, because I feel that this poem speaks to the craving or imagining what those solid promises can be.
Mm-hmm. And by the way, like in the very first stanza, when she's talking about these butterflies, the blue azures, they drink the black rainwater, and then they rise and float away into the fields. And that, like, immediately when I saw, I was like, oh, it's the fields of the solid field of promise that Kooser is saying in the first poem. And, what I also really like is I think there are actually a lot of connections to the second poem as well. The spiritual aspect of this poem, and sort of embracing the soul beyond what the body can do, is a really interesting way of thinking about springtime that I think the second poem does as well. So we talked about in the Hennen poem, Found on the Earth, that there's this combining of things, of romantic, possibly love for a person, of things growing in the springtime, and of trying to use words to describe it, sort of all coming together to create something more beautiful, that's more than the sum of its parts. And I think that's what's happening here in a couple of different ways too. So, when she's described, she brings Blake in. So again, this is the English poet William Blake, where Oliver here is relating a real story about Blake that he himself told about his childhood, which is that, as a child, he was staring out the window of his London apartment, sort of trapped in poverty and the dirt and grime of London. And he said that he, quote, beheld God's face in the window, that this was a sort of transformative experience, a revelatory experience that, like, lifted his soul up and inspired what became a lifetime of work that would sort of place him as one of the key figures of the Romantic era, both in art and poetry. And Oliver gets to this, like, we don't know what Blake saw, like literally, or what he imagined or something like that. But I love that Oliver just imagines that he saw a butterfly, that he saw the same thing that she saw, and that it lifted him up in the same way that it lifted her up, that seeing the beauty of this butterfly with its wings and taking flight is so beautiful that he thought of it as God. and that it gave him wings too, to go and be creative and do his thing and create something out of nothing. Which brings me to this other thing that I that I love in the middle of the Blake story, where she's saying, "Of course," he screamed, "and seeing the bobbin of God's blue body." I did not know what a bobbin was. I had to look it up. And a bobbin is a spool, like the kind of cylindrical, if you
Mm-hmm.
sew or stitch, it's a
Yeah.
cylindrical thing that holds a bunch of thread for sewing and stitching.
Mm-hmm.
And it's perfect because a bobbin, when there's nothing on it, it looks like a butterfly. I imagine, like, it's got the spread wings on the side, but it's thin in the middle, like a butterfly's body is, absent the wings. But then it also holds so much thread in such a small space. It exists for this purpose of creating and generating, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what starts as this like tight spool of yarn or thread can make a beautiful coat or a blanket or something colorful and amazing. And that what he is seeing here is maybe a butterfly. Probably wasn't actually a butterfly in Blake's real life, but it might as well have been, she's saying, because it is creating something bigger and more generative than just whatever it was. And that's, I think, part of the message that she's getting through here.
And as you're saying this, I wonder if we can take it even like a step forward and think about it not necessarily as a butterfly, but as the beauty, right? Like thinking about the motif throughout so much of Mary Oliver's poetry of like beauty and nature. Whatever was out there at the window that Blake saw was the beauty that feels divine and therefore inspires to create.
Yeah. It's all the same thing, right? I mean, and Blake describes it as God. Oliver describes it as a butterfly. You know, maybe it was something else. Maybe he looked out the window and observed, you know, someone helping someone else who was in trouble. Or like maybe it was some other thing that is God or beauty or whatever this connective tissue is that we have lots of different names for. And that is something that can sort of lift us out. And I mean, to sort of bring it back to this theme of the spring, and where I think it connects to both of these other poems, right? That you know, in this last bit that she sort of goes like, well, anyway, like Blake, the poor, you know, the Hosier's son or whatever, he stood up, like he saw what he saw. Stood up, he turned away from the darkness, whatever it is, and entered this life of the imagination, where it's not just about, you know, if we're using seasonality here, what I feel like she's saying, and what the other poems were saying as well, particularly the second one, that it's not just about like surviving the winter and making it to the next stage. It's not just like getting by. It's that it's generative. It's like that recognizing whatever this beauty is, seeing what Blake saw, seeing what Oliver is seeing with the butterflies, that this creates this multiplying, like, kind of wild life of the spring that opens up all kinds of new doors, that is much more than just surviving. It's something additive and generative that I think is what we're always sort of striving for in life, that in my opinion, like, makes life really worth living. And it can be hard to sort of behold it and keep it in your mind, but I sort of think in a way that's what they're all getting to here.
It's believing in the things that you cannot yet see.
The possibility, yeah, the field of promise, that it's not here yet. But that if we can keep that sort, you know, that hope springs eternal, right? That if you can keep that vision, that hope alive, that even when you're in these sort of dark straits, or a deep winter, or 5 feet of snow, or whatever else, you know, that hope can nurture you in those times, and then can help spring you into whatever next time happens, however it shows up. And it's not going to show up exactly the way you think. But yeah, that it gives you this opportunity, these sort of wings. I mean, this isn't a poem I chose for today, but the Emily Dickinson line of like hope being the thing with feathers, that that it's something that can help you take flight in the way that these butterflies are, even if you don't literally have wings, or even if it's, you're in dark times. So hopefully some hope there for us and for our listeners.
Indeed. And so that's how we are getting into the spring season.
That's the only way I know how to do it. So we hope that that all of you got as much from these poems as we did. And thanks for joining me, Annie, on this hopeful journey in a not so hopeful time. We'll see everybody next time.
See you all next time. Happy spring.